Right, everybody, welcome and to another wonderful session, which is part of the New Politics and Afrofuturism program at the University of the Underground, where we're basically calling for Black radical imagination and pop culture as powerful vehicles for propelling progressive social justice narratives to mainstream audiences, with a focus on Afrofuturism, Black activism, arts and culture, climate justice, along with political theory and practice. For anybody that's new to this and is not aware of what the University of the Underground do or are, the University of the Underground is a free, pluralistic and transnational university based in the basement of nightclubs with its headquarters in Amsterdam. But of course, due to global events, this program is all online. So the title of this wonderful lecture that we've got for you is titled Archives and Fugitives, and with the wonderful educator Zara Julius. Just to tell you a brief bit about Zara, and I'm sure she'll go into and tell you more of her practice and what she does. Zara Julius is an interdisciplinary social practice artist, researcher, and vinyl selector based in Johannesburg, South Africa, with a background in anthropology, religious studies, and photography. Her work is concerned with the relationship between aesthetics, frequency, and fugitivity, and working with sound, video, performance, and objects. Zara Julius's practice involves the collection, selection, and creation of archives through extensive research projects. She's also really especially interested in the evolution of spiritual music forms and how they find themselves in contemporary global bass music. Zara selects vinyls regularly in South Africa, most notably at MTN Bushfire, rocking the Daisies, Red Bull Music Festival, Johannesburg, and AfroPunk. And that is just a little taste of who Zara is. And Zara, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to share your wisdom, your thoughts with us. And we greatly appreciate it. And I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you so much for that and having me. Hi, everybody. I wonder if I could ask like quite a big request going forward. If anyone is comfortable putting their camera on, it would really help me to be able to connect with you, those who have turned it off. Just because otherwise I'm like speaking to names and it's difficult for me to, the way I like to work is to have a bit more kind of interactivity if possible. So thank you for those who are obliging and putting up with me. Yeah, so I think the way I'm gonna work today is basically have like a casual conversation with you, hopefully, and speak to you, chat through a bit of my work and a bit of my interests in this idea of frequency and the archive and how I engage with the archive as I guess, communicating a frequency. I wonder if I could just get a quick show of hands if anyone was able to read the resource that I shared beforehand. Okay, nobody. All right, so not a problem. That document basically, it's quite a great, it's like an introduction to quite a good book that kind of speaks through, it kind of speaks through explaining what the archive is, right? So I think this is a word that has been thrown around really frequently of late, in South Africa at least. A lot of, I mean, there's a few haters of the word, the archive, and people have created memes bashing archival work, which is really interesting to me considering, we're in a country, I mean, I'm in a country that, whose archive is still very much a colonial archive and an apartheid system archive, in that, our country is like less than 30 years old, really. Our democracy is less than 30 years old, and so archival work is actually extremely important within my context, right? In trying to adequately tell stories and adequately represent the majority of those who live within this country. So some people are haters of the archive. I am not one of those people. I am quite a lover of the archive. And the archive meaning a variety of different things, right? So I think the way in which we firstly understand it is, the archive is, books, maybe administration documents, bureaucratic documents from the past, things like, in South Africa, what's quite interesting is that there's really good prison archives from the colonial era and the apartheid regime that really document the racialization and criminalizing of Blackness and of colorness. Of color is not really a word that we use here. South Africa had a 4 races thesis, which understood people as categorized either Black, white, colored, and Indian. Colored being something very particular in South Africa, which should not be translated to the American or the UK context. Colored meaning people who are of mixed ancestry historically, right? So basically it was a way for the apartheid government to categorically erase people's, I mean, it's laughable because it's so extremely violent, but to erase people's racial backgrounds or ancestral backgrounds and to put this term colored on them. So basically it, in some ways, sort of bastardizes a whole population of people with varying kind of, geographical background. So people who have been racialized, colored in South Africa could have ancestry in Mauritius, could have ancestry from South Asia, could have ancestry from St. Helena, from Madagascar, Zanzibar, Irish. My own ancestry is part Irish, part indigenous Khoi, part Zulu, part Xhosa, which is obviously a local ethnic group here. But basically, people could have all these different types of histories, but they were all classified as colored, right? As a way to kind of deal with the inconvenience of difference, which we know across the world that has always been the kind of central gripe of the colonizer. And so the document thinks through things like bureaucratic, the archive is typically understood as, these bureaucratic documents, maybe some photographs, often a lot of books, those kinds of like volumes, those things that you typically find in a museum. But the reading that I circulated thinks to the archive and complicates the archive a little bit, right? And so it thinks to the archive as not just these things that are, maybe like a piece of paper. This is a visitor pass that would probably be considered as part of the archive, but not just something that's on a piece of paper or a visual document, but we are embodied archives, right? So myself, I am a living archive. I have embodied the knowledge from my life, but also I am embodying, all these different geographic contexts that I spoke about in one individual potentially, right? Depending to what extent I've been able to access that information, right? So this reading, which is archive and the repertoire, thinks through the repertoire as moments of gesture. So gesture, dance, spoken word, hair braiding, these are all actually, these are modes of, these are archival practices, right? And they're legitimate. And so it's really important to not, at least for myself, to not hierarchize, to not place, different forms of archive on a hierarchy, because then you run a risk of recapitulating the colonial order, recapitulating violent structures of power, right? And so the repertoire of embodied memory is conveyed in gestures, the spoken word, movement, dance, song, and other performances, offers alternative perspectives to those derived from the written archive, and is particularly useful particularly useful to a reconsideration of historical processes of transnational contact. So the reading that I sent out thinks about this through Latin America, obviously influenced by slave trade and cultural contact in that way, what anthropologists like to call syncretism, cultural syncretism, where you have different cultures kind of coming together and developing into new things. So that's where religious practices like Santeria or in Cuba or Candomblé or Haitian Voodoo become really salient, right? As these archives of memory, these archives of legitimate knowledge that need not be hierarchized according to what a white archive may look like. Are you guys all following me? Yes, no? Okay, cool. I like to just temperature check so I know I'm not speaking into the void. So when I think through archive, I'm particularly interested in this notion of frequency, right? So not just thinking through what kind of information can an archive give me that is like dates, times, how people were living in a particular space, but what kind of frequencies are present in the archive, and how, so another kind of way of thinking through frequency is resonance. So what is resonating with me, a viewer, or me, someone who is maybe both of the archive and studying the archive, right? What is resonating with me, and what is this thing that allows it to resonate? And for me, that's frequency. So you can think about, I mean, a lot of people think through in this way with regards to sound studies. And you can think about things with, like, you can think about these as things of sound, but actually for me, it's frequency in that it transcends the materiality of the archive, right? So it's not just how something looks, but there's something in it that I'm able to vibrate with on a more deeper haptic level, right? And so, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think sound in some ways, it's almost, if we're thinking about, I mean, we're all kind of consensus that like racialization is a process. It's not something that is inherent, right? So I have been racialized as colored in South Africa, identify as Black, but both of those things have been imposed on me, and I'm not inherently someone who is colored, right? And the only people that were never racialized are people who are white, right? And so what becomes really interesting with regards to this is when you're dealing with the visual archive or written archives, whiteness is often thought of as this invisible thing, this thing that you cannot really pinpoint. But when you're dealing with sound and the sonic, or in this case, frequency, which maybe includes the sonic, but also includes the gestural and includes the visual, it allows for, it kind of introduces a kind of visuality of whiteness in a way. It kind of, it points to whiteness in a way that I think white people are not particularly used to, which for me really kind of speaks to this idea of frequency and resonance. So, I mean, I could read a whole bunch of stuff, but I'm not going to. Yeah, I think it basically makes race a very kind of material experience for folks who have not been historically racialized. And so there are a few projects that I've worked on. I'm gonna share my screen now. If you have access to headphones, it's probably a good moment to put those on. But there are a few projects that I've worked on. The first is Proclamation 73. It was an archival project in a city called Durban in South Africa. Durban, I mean, I'm not sure if anyone here is aware, but South Africa has the biggest Indian population outside of India. Indian meaning people from the subcontinent of Asia, from South Asia, right? We have the kind of biggest diaspora globally. I think after us is probably Canada. And so Durban is a city where, it was colonized by the British, where other parts of South Africa were colonized by the Dutch before it was colonized by the British, but Durban and the whole region was colonized by the British first and foremost. And issues of indenture were, there was a big kind of process of indentured labor from India during the 1816 was the kind of beginning year of indentures. So there's a big Indian population in Durban, and also a big Zulu population in Durban. The province is called KwaZulu-Natal, right? But the archive in Durban specifically, the official government archives, kind of really focus on whiteness, but not in any kind of critical way. it really kind of has a nostalgic feeling towards Britishness in many ways, or Anglo-Saxon identity, and then understandings of what it means to be Zulu, obviously not in any nuanced way, but relating to figures like Shaka Zulu, who was a really prominent king, and to different wars like the Anglo-Boer War, or the battle between the Zulu and the English, where the Zulu actually won. But there's a really big gap in the archive that doesn't take into account the complexities of race and doesn't take into account the ways in which people were spatialized according to race. So during apartheid, I mean, there's a lot of historical background that I have to give you, but essentially during apartheid, people, depending on how people were racialized, they were forcibly removed from their areas so that, favorable areas were designated for white people to reside in only. And other races were separated from each other so that there was no racial mixing, right? So this project really tries to complicate the archive. I went around to people's homes with a scanner. I was like a Jehovah's Witness with a scanner, and like literally going to people's homes and scanning people's family albums, and engaging in conversation with folks. And we put on an exhibition of about 150 images in the state gallery, well, in the city's government gallery, of people who are not considered, whether it's Durban or like across the country, like nationally, as like worthy of speaking about, right? Because they didn't fit into the old dispensation and they don't fit into the new dispensation either. And these are people who've been racialized as colored and people who've been racialized as Indian. Historically, a lot of these people lived in the same areas before they were forcibly removed by the Group Areas Act. That is my speed summary of South Africa's apartheid history. You can do your Googles in your own time to the nuances. But I'm going to play something here, and then I'm going to play some other clips, and then we can chat afterwards.
They actually lived on a ship, and they had 3 children. My grandfather was the eldest and 2 sisters, so it was 3 of them. They actually lived on the ship, and they traveled with their father, who was a Javanese. So they got Javanese blood in them. And what had happened was when my grandfather was about 7, and his sisters were about 5 and 4, their mother died on the ship. Their father couldn't take care of him, and he brought him back to South Africa. And he left them with their aunt, Auntie Mary Ann, who lived in Ellis Street. Do you know where Ellis Street is? I don't know what it's called now. It's the main street in town, going towards the beach. Okay. She had a house there, and she brought them up. And until they were like teenagers, and then she died, and they had to fend for themselves. My grandfather and them, even the accent, can you see the Javanese and the Indian? That's me and my brother.
So my birth certificate tells me that I'm Mauritian. So Mauritian comes from my father's side. That's what Mauritians look like. So it's possible that's where the Mauritian comes from.
It's not as easy as South Africans think this thing. This thing is complex, or it's very, very complex. And we thought that this thing doesn't.
And the brother in Rhodesia was the same father. He was white. So she used to visit her brother in Rhodesia a lot. And he used to visit her, but he wasn't aware that he had colored brothers and sisters. He knew about Jerry, Uncle Ivan's father, because he was the eldest. So he knew about him, but the others he didn't know.
He couldn't come and visit us because we were dark skinned. He visited his sister, who was fair skinned. She's already there in radio. She went over to Rhodesia. There she was white, but he had married a white woman. don't know how all these children were, all white these children, I don't know. I hope they were. But yeah.
And the pain of separation is still there. Why we had to leave that home. And this was a foreign house, a foreign place that we didn't know anybody. I think the emotional pain, so I can still feel from, it must have hurt my parents more. And whenever we broached that, it was always, yes, we must live. And it would stop at that. So it was much more painful for them.
Mommy's mother was I think Zulu, black, and her father was white. No, we don't have any photos. I don't think anybody's got a photo of her.
For example, my late father, if he stood in the kitchen speaking Zulu, you'd never say it was an Indian. He grew up in Bedlam and Amshloti, where my grandfather is born. And he could speak perfect. I did Zulu speaking friends and they would burst out laughing because they say, oh, Jiva, we can't talk like your father. Because he spoke what they call rural Zulu. Killed people in many ways. Killed you inside, not physically. Other people died of just heartbroken being moved. And let's not talk about forced removals where they have to kill people who are equally devastated, dumped miles away, banished. That's another story that's still not been told,
I started dancing, learning walls, to hide all this bitterness, to stifle this thing. You black guy, you couldn't dance with this one yet because you weren't fair. So what I had to do, crush up on my dancing. Then I would like to dance because this guy can dance really well.
Okay, I mean, were you able to pick up parts of what was said? Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, I felt like she deserved to be seen twice. So, I mean, there's so much to chat about. So, I mean, obviously, the images that I showed, I mean, maybe I should just go back to them quickly. So obviously the images that I showed and the narrative, right, from the Durban Project, from Proclamation 73, they obviously provide like very like clear like information about the experiences of being forced to be removed, the experiences of being racialized in particular ways in Durban. And these images obviously provide like moments in history, right? So like that is cool, that's important archival work, but I'm over that now. So that's the kind of the level at which I was engaging in the archive in that particular project. But now I've been dealing a lot more with the sonic and thinking through frequencies of Blackness, specifically Blackness in the expanded sense. So I suppose in the ways in which Steve Biko would have termed Blackness as something that is inclusive of those who have been racialized. So, and the Black consciousness, people who are racialized Indian and colored would have are identified as Black. So I'm more interested now in like the frequencies of Blackness. So yes, I'm seeing images of a wedding and photographs from a wedding in a botanical garden, but there's something that I'm resonating to in the image that is beyond the indexical, right? I don't know if anyone else here, I would love to see how you guys feel about this, but do any of these images look very similar to images of your own parents' wedding? Specifically for those who have not, those who were racialized as maybe Asian or whatever. Because I mean, throughout, so I do a lot of work in the Caribbean as well, and a lot of images, people didn't have access to big banquet halls or whatever when you're racialized in particular ways, right? And so the botanical garden becomes this place where the backdrop to all these family moments, specifically wedding photos, and that seems to be a recurring thing that for me resonates on a particular frequency that I think almost trips up whiteness in a way that whiteness in itself is not even aware of, right? Because I'm resonating with this, so is someone in Barbados is able to resonate with this, right? With these images in particular ways. Obviously, I'm using broad strokes. Obviously, there's more nuance to these things, but I have an hour to talk about something, so there's not much nuance that can really come into this. So these images as well, I mean, if you're thinking through what I was speaking about earlier about, being able to listen to the visual, hear the visual and see the sonic, these particular images, especially these ones of people walking in the street, like are so telling in ways, it's almost, you can hear, I mean, it's particularly this image of this uncle on the front, the uncle walking by himself and there's a Black man behind him, and the kind of ways in which Blackness gets silenced, right? Because there's obviously a hierarchy within racialization, especially under the apartheid regime, where you had white people who are East Asians who are basically like honorary whites, underneath that you had people who are South Asian, and then underneath that you have people who were racialized as colored, and then Black people, what people used to like to call African, were right at the bottom of the pecking order. And there's, you know, the silence is almost deafening in these images. And so, you know, images almost create a particular frequency beyond the obvious things that you know, on an affective and haptic level beyond the indexical, right? These images as well, I think, really speak to the same kind of dynamic. I mean, just things like a doily on the back of a couch, you know, like a crocheted doily on the back of a couch. It provides a particular type of affective intimacy that, yeah, for me resonates on a different level, right? And then, so the same could be said in the audio clip that I shared, where people are talking about particular things, but there's emotion in the voices. But beyond that, there's also, I don't know if you picked up, but some of the characters were like deliberately whispering. I'm not sure if anyone picked any of that up, right? Especially there was one auntie who's actually the woman in the yellow dress on the bottom of the screen. She's whispering, although she's in the privacy of her own home and there's no one else there to hear except me, right? And so what are the ways in which just something like a whisper speaks to the ways in which these conversations are allowed to happen or have historically happened, right? That for me really disrupts our understandings of the archive and really introduces this thing like this notion of the repertoire or of gesture or sound making as a valid, you know, repository of knowledge, right? Or a valid place to kind of, you know, gain more deeper understanding and a moment in which we may resonate. So in South Africa specifically, people who are racialized, colored, it was advantageous for you to highlight your white ancestry, just like pure economics. And we see this within colorism globally, where it's advantageous to you know, to put, I mean, someone who looks like me gets way more privilege and access than someone who's a lot darker skinned than I am, right? Also someone who sounds like me, and then here we go back to this idea of the sonic. You know, I went to a private school. I sound very much like urban, you know, I think urban in South Africa means something different to what it might mean in the UK and in the US, where urban actually means Black, where here it doesn't necessarily mean that. But you know, I sound like I'm from a big city. You can hear that that I went to a private school, right? Where, you know, there's particular types of accents that are attributed to people who are racialized, colored, and those accents are very much, you know, there's a lot of discrimination according to those accents. And there's a lot of access that different accents can and cannot give you. Another uncle in the audio was speaking about how he's dark skinned. He's the gentleman in the bottom left in the pink shirt. So he's really dark skinned. And he, you know, recounts when he was younger going to dances, needing to learn how to waltz really well so he could, you know, engage with women because he was dark skinned. Even though he's in, you know, a dance where there's everyone else in the room has been racialized as colored because you couldn't socialize with people who were racialized differently to you under the apartheid law. But there's ways in which colorism really plays into it, right? So there's obviously racial categorization, but there's also the nuances of colorism superimposed upon that. And then, you know, things like the gesture of dance and of a particular type of dance, right, has particular types of currency. So the waltz has a particular type of currency versus, say, what we maybe might engage with now in contemporary South Africa or during the 90s, what we call like Pansula dance, which was a dance that you see that is danced to Kwaito music. And so there again, something as, you know, seemingly innocent as a waltz is extremely loaded with archival information, right? And allows him particular types of movement, or that's the goal or the hope, right? So these other videos that I sent, so with kind of like thinking through the archive in this way, I've been working a lot more with sound. I am a vinyl selector, and I have quite an extensive collection of spiritual music from the African continent and the African diaspora that I've been working with a lot. And trying to think through what is sound doing as opposed to how does sound, right? And what are the ways in which we're able to resonate through sound that allows us for these brief moments to exit this moment, to kind of exit the racial moment, if I make any sense. So, so we're basically, for those of us who've been racialized, there's ways in which, I mean, if you prescribe in any way to kind of Afro-pessimism in some ways. I mean, I know this talk is about Afrofuturism, but I'm quite disinterested in Afrofuturism, to be honest. And I find it quite toxic, and I'll tell you why. Because it assumes that we cannot find moments of freedom within this lifetime, right? And I'm not an Afro-optimist either, but Afrofuturism also assumes that we must now be alien beings in order to be free, when we still haven't been afforded the experience of being human, right? And this thing of being racialized, actually, is about removing being. So you are Black non-being, you are Indian non-being, right? You are Asian non-being, actually, is what it's about. If whiteness is what the standard to which we are judged, our humanness is judged, or our being is judged, right? Or against which, sorry. And so I'm kind of, I'm quite interested in the question of how we may like fashion Black life, Black, obviously in the expanded sense, under duress and in the face of perpetual and enduring Black death, right? And these things that come as a consequence of racialization, coloniality, and especially in the settler colony. I don't know where majority of you are situated, but I wonder if I could just ask, you don't put up your hand if you are living in a settler post-colony. Okay. Alternative, okay. So, I mean, feel free to put on your mic. I wonder if I could just get an understanding of like where you guys are from. You can write in the chat if you need. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, my family's originally from China. We moved to Vietnam, where I was born, and then I grew up in the United States, and now I live in Germany.
Okay, so there's like so many levels here, right? So many levels of like of power rubbing up against each other. I mean, obviously the US, huge colony, huge settler post-colony. And today is Thanksgiving, if I'm not mistaken, or yesterday was Thanksgiving or something, I don't know. These are things that I don't acknowledge, so it's fine. But thank you for sharing. I mean, I don't know if anyone else can maybe share their locale with regards to this chat. Yeah, go ahead, Nadina.
So my parents are from Comoros, and they moved to France in the 80s, and now I'm in the UK. Okay.
So then what's also really interesting about these movements, right, and how frequency plays into it, is, yes, you're in the global north, but your experience, I would argue, I mean, I don't know you, right? So feel free to clap back if I'm saying anything out of pocket here. But the experience is still one of the global south, but just situated in the global north, right? Because there's reasons why folks needed to go to the global north in order to live or whatever, and also the destinations that our families choose to migrate to as well are very much influenced by colonial history. Like going to France is not not a mistake. There's reasons why he didn't come to South Africa, you know? And so these things like fully inform each other. And so this for me, like post is always like, you know, I say the post colony, but like what even is post in this experience of like enduring death, I suppose. I mean, I'm saying this all with a smile on my face because it's like, if you don't laugh, like, wow, you're just gonna be crying the whole time. Yeah, exactly. So Christopher's saying Angola and Portugal. I mean, even in South Africa, I mean, if you go to the UK, there's like a whole South African like contingent, albeit they're all white. Most of them are white South Africans. And that also speaks to a particular type of resonance with empire that I would argue is way stronger to the resonance that they have with South Africa, right? And that's, I mean, that's fine with me, but you know, these things are not mistakes, is basically what I'm trying to say. But so I've been working with like the sonic archive and thinking through the haptics of the sonic and the frequencies within the sonic, right? And this comes to this, you know what? Yeah, let me show you really quickly because I'm not looking at the time. But this brings me to this image, which is from a performance where essentially I perform as a priestess figure who's facilitating what I call rapture and ecstasy, right? Rapture for me, not being like the Catholic, the rapture, where like the whole world comes to an end, but the experience of the ecstatic, the experience of being enraptured, where you're embodying, where there's an embodiment of like this moment where you can breathe, you're being stripped up by what I call the spirit. And for me, the spirit of what's happening in these wedding images is exactly the same as what's happening within spiritual music. And, you know, when we're talking about resonance. And so this priestess figure, she plays particular types of music to, you know, music that is considered to induce rapture. So it's not necessarily like religious music exclusively. There's, you know, an Outcast song is equally valid, and so is a lot of jazz, equally valid. But she plays this music to water, right? And makes these sonic infusions of the spirit and then dispenses it in like an apothecary or like a, what in the US would be called a botanica, right? And so here, really just trying to think through multiple things. And these are all conversations. This is all stuff that I'm like figuring out in real time myself. None of this is kind of resolved work or resolved ideas. So any kind of like chats that you want to present, I'm super keen to hear them. But, you know, trying to think through disrupting hierarchies of understanding of the archive firstly, and through that, you know, through creating interventions into the archive, like with the Proclamation 73 project, where all these images that we selected, I then donated to the state archive, so that these moments of wedding, these moments of like extreme intimacy become the norm, because prior to that moment, the only images of people who are racialized as colored were orphans. And so, and it really kind of mirrors the use of the term colored as well, right? Which was to bastardize a whole population. And so literally there's like these three images of like, you know, St. Mary's orphanage for the colored or something in like Wentworth. And then there's like one photo of like a soccer player who was like a prominent national soccer player who was colored, but like, that's literally it in this particular archive that I was working with at the Old Courthouse Museum. And so there's ways in which you make interventions into the archive, which for me are really exciting. But then also the ways in which you engage with the archive now beyond that kind of typical kind of archival work. For me, how do we think through resonance? How do we think through frequency? And how does our understanding of race in frequency allow us to connect with something that that is not explicitly named, and that is only accessible by those who have been racialized in similar types of ways, right? And that's what I'm really interested in, is how can we have conversations with each other that both reveal and conceal simultaneously, without whiteness taking these things that for us give us the spirit and us give us moments of freedom and using it for their own means, right? Which is essentially what you know, if you think through the kinds of, the kinds of gatherings that would happen on plantations, or the Maroon Society, where people would go, maybe do a petit maroonage, where they would go to, somewhere far away from the plantation, and basically have a vigil of like ecstatic music overnight, and then come back to the plantation. That was all under secret for very strategic reasons, to ensure freedom and to ensure the sanctity of these things, right? And like, that's what I'm really interested in through the archive. I wonder, thanks Tracy, no stress. I wonder if there are any questions. Did you guys have a session directly after this? You're on mute.
Yeah, no, we haven't got another session, but guys, feel free to come off your mic. Go for it, Dee.
Thank you so much, Zara, for this inspiring talk. I mean, you engage audiences with your music and photography. That's how you invite them in, but then you hold them with very deep political discussions about identity. And I guess I'm so curious about your choice of vehicle and medium, and I guess your overall approach, please.
Sure. First of all, thanks. I've had like seriously failed Zoom chats before, so I'm glad this is not failing for you. But essentially for me, I'm really interested in engaging with people, and like that for me is what drives every project. So the project is not kind of medium dependent. So for me, I'm engaging with people, engaging with publics, I suppose, and then from there, I determine the ways in which this project requires a particular medium to be executed effectively, right? And that allows the project and the kind of data, for lack of a better word, to live with integrity, as opposed to saying, I'm a photographer, I only deal with photography, and therefore every project must now mutate itself and squeeze itself into this little box of photography. Because I think that in doing that, you kind of lose a lot of nuance, and you lose like the vitality, and also just like representing people's stories like ethically, right? Like that for me is always my central kind of agenda. It's like, how do we represent people, ourselves and each other really ethically? I mean, there's no way in which everything is like, I think that it's easy to like poke ethical holes into anything, right? So I'm not saying I've like, cracked this code, because I definitely have not. But my background is in anthropology, which has very big ethical considerations. And I guess that has kind of pushed my emphasis on the social in my practice, and pushed the emphasis in trying to tell stories that are simultaneously of myself and others. I'm not super interested in telling stories from the outside and being like, these people, I'm not like, this is not National Geographic. Yeah.
Brilliant.
No shade to National Geographic, but pay me National Geographic.
Thank you, Chris.
Zara, thank you.
Hey, nice durag.
Lockdown swag. That's how we're rolling right now. I have a question, because I've been doing some research in regards to acoustic music and its impact on the human body, and how there was this very specific decision to shift to a different frequency in audio, which I believe was in the mid-1900s, so it's maybe like 1940s, something around that mark. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you've done any research because you talk about resonance and around ritual, around practice, around connectivity, if you've actually looked into the technological shift and its impact in environments and people's bodies.
I mean, as I said, like I'm really interested in like people's experiences,
right?
And kind of try and keep my emphasis there. I mean, I've done a little bit of research around like, what's vibrating at what particular frequency and how does that have a particular effect, right? So, I mean, I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with EMDR. It's a therapy modality. So I did a lot of EMDR a few years ago to deal with my own trauma, and that's basically what got me going on frequency. Because I was like, whoa, if a frequency between 3 and 5 hertz, which mimics REM sleep, which is supposed to facilitate your processing of your day, of your memories, is able to uncover and help you reprocess particular types of trauma, how can I harness frequency to deal with the trauma of the everyday of those who have been nationalized? And that's basically where my, I guess, like scientific kind of interest kind of starts and in some ways stops. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was taking that and what you're saying about frequency on the body that kind of spurred my performance around, you know, playing music to water and then creating sonic tinctures and then prescribing them to people that come into the botanica and saying, yeah, this will heal you depending on the conversation I have, you know, the priest has with those who walk in, right? Because our bodies are, you know, supposedly 70 to 80% water. And what really interests me, and this is maybe another part of the same project that I haven't spoken about here because we're chatting about archives. So what really interests me is the echo chamber or the feedback loop that is happening across the Atlantic Ocean, you know, not just from the moment of the slave trade, but also that's happening in the contemporary era, right? So we think about, for those who are not familiar with Dr. Satan's echo chamber, an incredible, I'm gonna write it in the chat, and then y'all can do your Googles. Oops, sorry. Dr. Satan's echo chamber by Chudsuke, I think is his name. He speaks about reggae as this thing that creates a feedback loop throughout the entire Black diaspora, and even through, you know, amongst like white music forms as well, right? Like particular types of ska or particular types of punk, but you know, how does music, and also the thing about the echo is that you're never hearing the same thing. It's always mutating as the echo reverberates, right? Which again comes back to this idea of resonance, you know, comes back to this idea of frequency that, you know, it's almost like I don't know how, I just have gestures in me. I can't speak. But yeah, so that's, I think what you're speaking about, Christopher, is where what kind of spearheaded the performance and thinking through this travel of the sonic, the travel of these spiritual music forms, both at the moment of transatlantic slavery and in the contemporary era to the Atlantic Ocean. And I kind of see them as being carried by spirit through the waters of the Atlantic. And not in this like weird, like Beyonce kind of like fantasy world where, you know, where like, you know, not basically like this is not Black Panther, you know what I mean? Like I'm talking like in ways that are like very real for people, not, you know, like this is not fantasy, you know, being overcome by the spirit is not a hypothetical thing. It's a very real experience for people. And whether you're religious or not, maybe you've had similar experiences in the club, maybe you've had similar experiences just being, you know, as an adult, maybe your hair gets braided by your mom and you're transported, you know, like there are these moments that kind of trigger things in ways that are very real and embodied. And it's not just like because it looks nice and it sounds nice to say it. Yeah, that was a really roundabout way of answering your question.
I think it's a really important one. Dee had another question.
As a core producing a radio show and podcast, do you have any advice for recruiting individuals to interview or designing questions and recording these interviews?
Sure. Okay, so the first one is recruiting people. That it's literally all about your personal network. I mean, it depends what the theme is. I wonder if you can give me like an example of the theme of one of the episodes that you're trying to address. This is a moment where you respond.
Just to give you a bit of background, the projects that everyone, the full-time students and participants are taking is about looking at what the world looks like when people and the environment thrive simultaneously. So they'll be producing some kind of audio capturing moment, and I guess D, correct me if I'm misquoting you or I'm getting it wrong. It's just the prospect of bringing people in. So it might be things around relationships between humans and nature, or it might be another situation of politics around natural rights or ecofeminism or whatever. There's so many different strands. They're all going to be focusing on different things. So I guess these may be asking about methodologies of getting people involved.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I'm not super formal about these things. I mean, I think it really depends the approach that you're trying to take. Are you trying to get like, like expert opinions or expert voices on the show? Then you gotta holler at your your academics or your writers or people who are experts in the field. And that unfortunately requires a lot more of a formal approach. That means like sending emails and like following up people via email. I typically don't like to approach things in that sense, unless there are particular academics or whatever who have an understanding of publics, right? Because my big issue with a lot of academics is they don't know how to speak to the average person. And so unless you're another academic, like, what is the audience really going to get from what they're saying? And I think that form of information dispensing is like, I think we're past that moment now. I think it's the imperative. I mean, basically my advice to you is if you're going to find an academic, find someone who's a little bit down, basically, and can like chat to people like they're friends. And I think that's the most engaging thing that you can produce in any kind of like audio or even visual kind of media, right? Something that is like a bit more on the informal side. The other thing that you could do, I mean, there's this really great podcast that you can check out. I think it's called Phantom Power, terrible name, but really great podcast. And it's really well produced. And it's actually all about sound, art, sound things. But they have conversations with like experts, like academics, but the way in which it's produced really engages an audience. So, if an academic is speaking about, say, for lack of a better example, Britney Spears, they will play like Britney Spears in the background and it really holds you in, and it sounds really simple. But when you're dealing with the sonic, you really have to create an entire world for people. And it needs to feel immersive. Also, people are listening to podcasts with headphones most of the time, right? So really, really, my advice would be to really, really exploit that. And you're dealing with left and right channels, create a whole world, engage the right ear and engage the left ear. And that's like really, I don't know, you can be on a treadmill listening to a podcast, but you're now engaging with something completely different through really exciting kind of production. And it doesn't need to be expensive. In terms of approaching people, for my projects, I literally just go through people that I know, like friends or like vague kind of colleagues, and say, hi, do you know someone like this? And I've often just stopped people in the street who look like they might fit the right kind of thing. I mean, it sounds terrible, but I did work with some churches who practice in the Johannesburg inner city. And there was a particular church or type of church that I really wanted to work with. And the only church of that type that I had access to, it would have presented like a conflict of interest for me to work with that church. I literally just like went to the inner city, walked around, it's not particularly safe, but walked around and I saw a woman who was by herself and she was wearing a uniform. And I was like, hi, I'm so sorry to stop you, but I'm doing this research. Would you mind if I came, to your church and you kind of were my gatekeeper to this church? And, these basically people, the worst that can happen is someone says no and thinks you're a little bit crazy. But like, that's, I mean, that happens anyway. Do you know what I mean? Like people think you're wild anyway. I mean, it's like you're not really losing much. That would be my advice.
Can I have a suggestion on top of that?
Sorry?
Can I make a quick suggestion? I know we're running out of time. One thing with the...
I can go for a little bit longer if you guys want to. If you want to, I'm availing myself.
Appreciate that. I think we'll wrap up just so we can kind of tie it together. But one extra thing to take into consideration whenever you're producing a podcast is that you're not asking them to do a podcast. You're asking them to share information with you, right? So you're asking for a conversation, and as a result, you're then approaching to document it. The best way that I found in terms of getting people to speak with you on a recorded kind of platform or format is to engage in an element in that they can find it useful. So for example, are you working on something that you want to go back and forth a bit, that you want to refine? Is there something that you want people to consider? For example, I similar to Zara, we have friends, and out of those friends, like, hey, is there anything in the world that you're really interested in right now or you've been following for a while? Oh, do you want to explore that in a little bit more detail? And we had one person just say, listen, I've been kind of looking for someone or somewhere to just kind of talk about this who's on a mutual level. Let's do it. And then the exchange has to come in. How are you compensating them for their time? The most easiest way to do that is money. The second thing is about giving them the actual product at the end. Say, hey, here's the complete thing that I've edited of us talking. Use it as you want. I'm going to feature it here. And then it can also be a case of, if you do this, I can give you access to something else. So it doesn't have to be hardcore kind of capitalistic, but it does have to be mutually beneficial in some way, shape, or form.
I wonder if I can quickly jump in. I mean, I'm in South Africa. There's virtually like, we don't have a lot of means to produce cultural stuff here, right? Like our government doesn't support us. We don't have like grants, et cetera, et cetera. And the way in which a lot of our industry works here is like skill share. Hey, I would love to chat with you about this type of thing for a podcast. Do you mind chatting with me about this? And in exchange, these are the skills that I have. If you ever need any of them for free, I'm here, you know? And like, I think a lot of people in the creative industry, at least, are like super open to that because it's such a hard industry. So the link, this track was not found. Oh, wait, I know why. Sorry, let me get.
In the meantime, April, do you want to just launch your question and then we can wrap up?
Yeah, if you don't mind. I was just going to say thank you so much for sharing your work with us. I'm actually, so for my project for the University of the Underground, I want to focus it on mixed heritages because a lot of my family come from all over the world, basically. My granddad moved over from Kenya as an Indian to England. And I was actually, it sounds silly saying it out loud now, but like, I was actually going to use our photo albums at home as like a sort of focal point and a starting point to start reimagining what archives could be. And I just had a question to see, as someone who's already done a similar project, if you had any advice or like working with archives as institutions, what your experiences is with that as well.
Sure. I mean, so these types of things are so context specific, right? Like museums in South Africa are like basically defunct. Like there's no funding for them. There's no storage. There's like one lone like librarian who kind of just like is really into the stuff, but like also is super overworked, underpaid. Like they're getting a nice government salary. You know what I mean? Like it's basically there's like so much. It's like it's broken. The system is really, really broken. And so I think the things that I have encountered would be completely different to what you will encounter. I perceive that you will probably have a lot more hoops to jump through in terms of access, because there's not really all that much like, institutions are like, as I say, kind of falling apart. So I mean, you just drop someone an email. My uncle grew up with the husband of one of the librarians or the receptionist of one of the museums, and then she just like connected me to the head librarian, and then like that was that. And so I don't think I can really give you advice that would be helpful for your context. What I will say with regards to working with personal visual archives is they are extremely useful talking points, especially if you're dealing with your family. There will be a lot of assumptions around you already knowing particular information, right? And so when you're able to have an image art and you say, let's talk about this image, it, you know, the storytelling comes a lot easier. And in ways that I think are a lot, you know, like really exciting. And so I think really harness the visual elements of people's family albums and the stories behind different images, and even things like old ID documents, like really there's stories behind them. Like you really wouldn't think so, but like there's stories behind them, especially in my context where like the apartheid government just gave people random names, literally random names, and like random racial categories. And like there's so much, you know, there's stories about why that might have been and what the experience is dealing with, you know, bureaucratic systems. I mean, there's so much that you can get from just really basically rely on that. And just going back to Dee, and April, engage, having ideas of where you would like the conversation to go is important, but really engaging with people with compassion, no matter what the purpose is. Like compassion and empathy needs to be the central like focus of your practice. Otherwise, I'm not quite sure why you're doing anything. You know, like you really need to remember these are people, they're not just repositories of knowledge. And like engaging on a personal level really takes things far.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And that was truly amazing, Zara. Greatly appreciate it. As you can see, people giving you a round of applause. Thank you so much. And I think on that note, I think it's best we're going to basically leave it there. Thanks to everyone that joined us today from wherever you are. Greatly appreciated. And once again, Zara, thanks for sharing your wisdom and your time out today. Greatly appreciated.
And if you guys have any questions, you can just drop me a DM on Instagram, and I'm very happy to.
Do you want to share your Instagram handle so people?
Okay, we're going to do a plug moment now.
Yeah, plug. Or you can just plug anything that you're working on, or anywhere that I guess we can support you at all.
Sure. I mean, so my Instagram is there at Zarathustra Lives. It's a little poke at Nietzsche, but my link in bio has like a bunch of different stuff that I'm working on, different radio shows that I'm working on. I'm also developing a podcast for an entity that I run called Conjo, which facilitates like cross-continental like music collaboration and cultural collaboration, specifically in the Global South. And that will hopefully drop in April next year. I just got funding for that. So just keep your eyes peeled for that type of thing. On my Instagram if you're interested in the work. And I really hope to be in conversation with you in a more intimate way, because this is basically my crack, like chatting with people. I'm into it. So thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, everybody, and weekend.